In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Purple Mountain Majesties. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I will still say that Dark Matter and Kiowa Pecan are among my favorites from Noodler's. Being joined now by Purple Mountain's Majesties. Beautiful tone on the page. It does give some tone variation from each and every nib, but I find I like everything that I'm seeing. It shades well and consistently. It's not a super shader, but it does a very nice job at it. And it does it from each pen. Generally, on most papers, it can perform fairly well. When you can ink a pen and write on most any paper without having to consider what pen or paper you're on, for the most part, there's always some of those really poorly manufactured papers, then you know that the ink is a winner. And this one is a winner. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Fountain Pen Revolution Himalaya, their version 1 with the Fountain Pen Revolution Flex nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice, gentle purple that is easy to read on the page. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading. It is looking very nice. I know, looking at this, automatically this is not going to be a purple in this case for other people. And I'm going to tell you, hold on to your socks because they're about to be knocked off. Looking at the broad nib, we get a much darker tone than we had with the soft fine. Still beautiful. I think this one looks even better. I said it was a great ink. I said it was a winner, so I'm going to gush a bit about this one. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and it does it very well. In every single word, you get some nice darker areas in the letters and lighter. Beautiful. Looking at the music nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the broad, and it looks even better as a tone. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is still shading just as well as it did with the broad. Absolutely every single word with some super dark letters, with the rest of it keeping very purple. So nice to look at. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib. A Platinum 3776 with a broad nib. A Platinum 3776 with a music nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the soft fine nib, we're getting about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine, and how nice is that? Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. There is some shading, not as much shading as we had with the Clairfontaine, a bit more of an absorbent paper for that, but we are still getting shade spots. Spots that are a bit darker than the rest of it. Not much for shading, it's a more absorbent paper, and many of what we're going to look at here are. Looking at the broad nib, we get a darker tone than we had with the soft fine, and again, about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It still doesn't feather, it still doesn't spread, it still shades very well, shades about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. What kind of miracle is that that's going on here? Because this paper tends to absorb the shading. And in this case, I think it's still coming through very well. Amazing. Looking at the music nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, which is darker than the broad here. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's like a dream in how it's performing on this paper. It is shading. I'm stunned in how this is really performing here. They should sell this ink with this paper, or this paper with this ink. Looking at the back of the page, we see the amazing train continue forward as there's no bleeding, no ghosting, easily writing on the back of the page. Almost said back of the train. Choo-choo. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get about the same tone, just a little bit lighter than we had from the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's barely shading, it's almost not there really, it's not worth mentioning. Honestly, you can seek out a couple darker spots. It's not really there. This paper is almost never really given shade, so I'm not expecting it to start. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine of the broad. It is darker than a soft fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, it's just a very nice purple on the page. I will say I was a little disappointed going in. I kind of wanted to see it shade here because it had done so well on the other papers. I was hoping it was just going to carry on through. Looking at the music nib, it is darker than we had with the broad. It is a little lighter than we had with the music from the Clairfontaine. It is giving a little bit of feathering when you see on the TRY of geometry. You can see it there. There is some tiny feathers going on. It's not the end of the world. It is not spreading. It is not really shading. Yes, you can find a couple darker spots, but it's not something you should be counting on. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, easily writing back here. Fantastic.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine, and I was a little surprised. I was expecting it to be a little bit lighter. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not really shading. Again, like the last paper, we can go find a couple spots that are a little bit darker, but I really don't want to consider that as some shade happening here. Just a couple of moments in time. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than the soft fine, still a little bit lighter than we had with the broad from the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. I want to say we get enough of those dark spots that I'm going to say this is shading, which I wasn't really expecting for this paper. It does it sometimes, not all the time. I'm very happy to see that it's happening here because I'm enjoying this ink so very much. Looking at the music nib, we get about the same tone as a majority of what happened on the Clairfontaine. About the same tone. Now, we do get a little bit of feathering that occurs in only a couple spots. On the third line, when I get to that, you're going to see the hat part have a little bit of feathering, but it really doesn't show up anywhere else. We're not getting any kind of spread, and not really getting shading, but I guess you could choose some dark spots if you wanted to. Let it go. It didn't shade. It's okay. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we do get some light ghosting, but you could still write back here, but we have no bleed through touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Allegheny River Twilight. Here is J. Herbin Amethyst de Royal. Here is Noodler's Purple Martin. Here is Robert Auster Summer Storm.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. Surprising, kind of. We get a little bit of feathering, but it's really small woolliness on it. Not big feathers coming out, just a little. You see it on them in the top line. Look right there, you'll see what I'm talking about. So when it starts to look like it's darker, you're finding the feathers. Is no real spread. Maybe there's a tiny bit of spread. There's no real shading because if it gets darker, it feathers. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the soft fine nib, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. It does not shade. It does not like this paper, and I don't blame it. Because I got half a year left on this paper, and I'm continuing the course because it's what I do, but after this year's up, this paper's gone forever. Looking at the music nib, we get a little bit darker than we had with the broad. We get a little bit darker as a general tone than we had from the music on the Clairfontaine. We get some feathering, more than we have on the broad. We get some spread. It's there. It's a poorly manufactured paper. We get no shading. We do get a very nice purple tone, so let's leave it with that high note. Looking at the page underneath, you see a ton of spots where I circled because it bled through. This paper never lets me use the next page, but you can see why when you see the back, as there is tons of ghosting.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here is a green ink by Krishna Pasha Avari. Here is a gray ink by Diamine Graphite. Here is a pink ink by Pen BBS, their number 137. Here is a yellow shimmering ink by Diamine, their Golden Sands.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get around the same tone, just a tad bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering, which we always expect on this paper. We do get almost no spread. How's that sound? Almost no spread, but there is a little bit there. We get some shading spots, as in it's not just a couple of dark spots, there's quite a bit more, which makes me worry about bleed through with this paper. But it's not a ton, so we're going to see. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. It does feather fairly consistently the whole way through. I don't think the feathering that's there is the end of the world. Write big, write fast, like you're in a hurry. Maybe we can get a little less. So yes, there's spread with it. No, there's not shading. There's not even darker spots, which makes me feel like maybe that one's not going to bleed through at all. Looking at the music nib, it is just a little bit darker than we had with the broad. It does feather, I think manageably. It does spread, I think manageably. I don't know why you would write on this paper with a music nib, but if you did, I think you could manage it. It does not shade. Not a surprise, considering this paper really doesn't tend to do that. Looking at the page underneath, you see that the music nib bled a lot, touching the page. The broad, only the once. But on the back of the page, you see that there's quite a bit of ghosting. I don't think you could use it for additional note-taking.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Now, I'm sure you're expecting me to say that this is a dealer's choice. Well, you're wrong. No, that would be fair for you to say. However, for me, I really do find that a words. I'm not even editing this part out. A medium to wet flow broad is really where I like the color best. But I'll let it be a dealer's choice because I really did like the tone in every pen that I used, although I had one that I preferred the most. This isn't about my preference. It's about what's going to give the best writing experience. And the truth is, any pen will do.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.